Democracy and digitization increasingly belong together in elections, debates, and the growing world of information spread via social media. And the path to digitization has just been fast-tracked in the past 1.5 years through the current pandemic. The virtual world has grown so much in importance, offering almost unlimited possibilities of communication. On the one hand, strengthening democratic participation, on the other hand, increasing the opportunity to spread fake news, hate speech, and conspiracy theories, giving those who use the platforms digitization offers the possibility to influence politics and society. My name is Jennifer Sarah Boone, and I am very happy to welcome you to our symposium, Digitization and Democracy, organized by the Israel Academy of Sciences and Humanities, the US National Academy of Sciences, and the German National Academy of Sciences, Leopoldina, to discuss associated risks, policy options, and trends from a scientific point of view. The symposium is being streamed live via YouTube as well, so not only a warm welcome to our audience in Zoom, but also to our viewers on YouTube. Thank you to all of you for joining us. Before we start with our panel, I would like to hand the word to Professor Shimon Ullman, member of the Scientific Committee of the Symposium, Israel Academy member, and professor at the Weizmann Institute of Science, Israel, for some introductory words.
Thank you, Jennifer, and good morning in Washington, DC, and good afternoon in Berlin and in Jerusalem. I'd like to welcome everybody present to the opening of our symposium on digitization and democracy. The concept and the practice of democracy have old roots, but because of continuous changes, they need constant review and adjustments. And this includes, of course, changes in the social and technological context, which will be discussed in the symposium. The digitization revolution created a very powerful new context, which raises both risks and opportunities to democracy, and we will deal with both the challenges and opportunities throughout our 4 sessions. Many years ago, I was in a discussion over dinner about fairness and justice in the relation between individuals and government with the philosopher Sidney Morgenbesser. And Morgenbesser started with recounting an anecdote from an encounter he had when he was a candidate to participate in a jury duty in New York in a case involving a police officer. And he was asked at some point, have you ever been treated unjustly or unfairly by the police? Sidney answered to them, unjustly, yes, but not unfairly. They asked him what he meant, and he said that he participated in an anti-war demonstration and he was beaten by the police. It was unjust because I was just standing there doing nothing wrong, he said, but it was not unfair because they did the same to everybody. This was an introduction to a long discussion about justice and fairness, and democracy was involved. And I recalled some of this discussion when we had our discussion during the planning of the current symposium. It was fascinating to hear about fundamental new issues to confront, which were raised by digitization and its effect on democracy, and to learn about novel insights and methods to address the new challenges, which we are going to hear about and discuss in the next few days. It also reminds us that to keep democracy functioning, it needs continuous review and continuous adjustments that we as scientists can contribute to. The symposium was planned over a long period with many discussions of the program committee of the 3 participating scientific academies that you heard about. And I wanted to express thanks to the presidents of the 3 academies for initiating the joint meeting, the members of the planning committee, and the wonderful staff that provided help in the discussions and the planning stages. Very warm thanks to the speakers and moderators in this symposium. We have really an incredible group of experts participating and leading discussions. And finally, thanks and welcome to the audience here in this session and all the 4 sessions to follow in the symposium. So welcome, and I hope you find the symposium interesting, challenging, and enjoyable.
Thank you very much, Professor Ullman. In our 4 sessions, we will be talking about content moderation, the potential of digitization to enhance democracies, and we will be taking a look at where we stand right now and where we are heading. We are so happy that renowned speakers from Germany, Israel, and the United States are taking the time today and tomorrow to discuss the topics with us, with each other, and with you, dear audience. And I would like to ask our panelists to switch on their cameras. And dear audience, we ask you to submit your questions via the Q&A function so that we can spark a discussion with everyone to make it digitized and interactive. You can find the Q&A tool on the control board in the lower part of your screen, and my helping hands in the director's room will collect the questions and feed them into the panel discussion. If you want to assign a question to a specific panelist, please indicate that. And now it is my pleasure to introduce our 3 well-known speakers for our panel discussion on digitization and democracy. Where do we stand? Each one is a leading expert in her field, and I would like to start with Niva Elkin-Koren, Professor of Law at the Boone Faculty of Law, Tel Aviv University, Tel Aviv, Israel, a chair and board member of numerous scientific associations. She studies the intersection of law, computer science, and data science. She has written extensively on content moderation by social media platforms, governance of AI, and governance by AI. Thank you so much for joining us today. And I would like to start straight away with our panel topic. From your perspective, where do we stand regarding digitization and democracy?
Thank you, Jennifer. This is, I'm really thrilled to be here. It's such an important topic and great to be on this opening panel. I'd like to start with the obvious, that digitization has created opportunities for social mobilization and democracy. And the reason I'd like to start with the obvious is because we tend not to remember that as we burst into nostalgic wave of how great old media, mass media used to be, and tend to forget that some of the major social movements that we now take for granted, such as Me Too, climate change, Black Lives Matter, may have not been possible given the way in which public discourse was mediated by media conglomerates that were selling eyeball to attract the lowest denominator. And so I think this is important to start with this, because otherwise the dilemmas that we're facing as we are looking into some of the challenges would have been easy. But there are, of course, challenges. And actually, I'd like to focus on 3 type of challenges that we are facing nowadays related to democracy with respect to digitization. And the first is the way in which we govern behavior by AI. So we see how machine learning is now being used in order to govern behavior of actors in predictive policing, in consulting, judges on releasing offenders, in determining social welfare benefits, and also on filtering some illicit or allegedly illicit content on social media platforms. Now, these AI tools introduce new ways of generating social and legal norms. They shape the behavior of the actors that in a way that is based on probabilistic predictive models, which are based on past performance, and that is completely different than the way in which we govern behaviors through law, and therefore, in many cases, challenge some of the values that Shimon was just introducing us to, that is equality, but also in some cases the autonomy of the players. This requires, of course, rethinking some of the tools for restraining and oversighting the use of these measures by both corporate players and government. Second challenge relates to data. And here the question is the control over data and how we manage access to data. Data is, of course, a key resource in the data economy. It is essential not only for data-driven innovation, but also for scrutinizing some of the players that are using data in their performance. Those players actually currently control access to the data. These are not just social media platforms, but also car manufacturers, pharmaceutical companies, and also governmental agencies. And one of the major challenges is to ensure access to data, both for scientific research, for social activists and investigative journalists, and at the same time to also enable some competitive pressures, like enabling competitors in the market to provide alternative services or products that would be more friendly to civil and human rights. The third and major challenges that we are facing is platformatization, a very long word to address a social media platform that is the elephant in the room of this conference, that these platforms are, of course, not producing content that could be harmful, but are facilitating access to content, but actually also controlling what content is becoming available either by curating, editing, or newsfeed, or social search results, or by filtering or blocking content. Now, many scholars, including myself, have actually pointed out the danger in using excessive power by social media platform over public discourse, but I really like to point out one particular point that I think that is often overlooked, and that is the way in which social media platforms are increasingly being used by governments in order to enforce the law. And we've seen that in the case of COVID tracking apps, how GAPL actually managed to define the rules of access for proximity tracking apps. We've seen that in surveillance cases, but also in content moderation. So the growing dependency of governments on platform in performing governmental enforcement is a big concern, not only because it allows governments to bypass some of the constitutional constraints that are in place over the use of their power. Usually a government has to go to the judge, right, to courts in order to get a warrant. Now they can bypass this just by flagging some content and enabling platforms to remove it. Arguably, these type of cases, platforms have some discretion over what to remove or not to remove, but the Boone relationship ensures that platforms have some strong incentives to comply. And actually, data that we see in both in Israel and in Europe, and it's partial data that we have show a high level of compliance, and so. This practice is a major concern, in my opinion, maybe the most important concern that we are facing now, and that is the synergy that we see between governments and platforms that not only allow governments to bypass some constitutional constraints, but also create some democratic deficit in the sense that it requires governments to comply with what is available to them in terms of enforcement by social media platforms, and actually to shape their enforcement strategies according to what tools are available on social media. And that is, to some extent, is really weakening the role of governments, and may create new types of concern, because it is strengthening the hold of social media platforms on our everyday life without sufficient safeguards, checks and balances that we normally have in the relationship between citizens and their governments. So I'll stop here and looking forward to more discussion later.
Oh, thank you so much. Yes, we will dive deeper in a moment. Now I'm very happy to welcome Shafi Goldwasser, who is director of the Simons Institute for the Theory of Computing and professor of electrical engineering and computer science at the University of California, Berkeley. Calling numerous awards in mathematics and computer science her own, her pioneering contributions include the introduction of probabilistic encryption, interactive zero-knowledge protocols, and elliptic curve primality testings. It's fantastic to have you with us. And my first question for you is, from a computer science perspective, how has digitization influenced democracy in the past years?
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you very much for inviting me. So first of all, when you say democratization and democracy, I guess there's so many different models for democratic rule. But I guess what's common to all of them is the principle that everyone should have the same opportunity to influence the decision that affect people in society. And that there's a central mechanism, which is elections, which are open to all, and the rule of law. So it's easier said than done. So even in the olden days, before we had the opportunity to discuss doing this with electronic means, there's a question: how do you give everybody the opportunity to vote? How do you make sure that the votes were tallied up correctly? How do you make sure that votes are private? And how do you make sure that whoever is running the vote is accountable? It seems immediately, as Niva said, that the ability, computers and connectivity are just right there to solve these problems, because we've expanded our ability to communicate. We can reach many more people, essentially everyone, regardless of geographical location. We can tally votes more efficiently than by hand. And we can even identify people more accurately. However, the problem is that we've done all this communication, and we have these platforms for communication, but we haven't really expanded our ability to trust. So, again, whether it's fake accounts, politicians raising doubts about integrity, increasing accusations and against each other, there's a lot of untrustworthy behavior and distrust in each other as a result of electronic systems. But on the good side, I think that this is a temporary state, that it is the state of what happens today in terms of elections, both in Israel and the US. I'll talk about that a little bit more in terms of in both places, there were big initiatives to go over to electronic voting, which were abandoned almost entirely. I think, though, in principle, that shouldn't be the case. So again, I would like to give you 3 examples where we can use digitization, we can use computers, we can use cryptography in order to address problems at the heart of democracy. So the first one is election. So the most basic mechanism, if we think about the issue of one person, one vote, we need to determine a digital identity if we're going to vote electronically, and we have means to do so. We need to ensure privacy of the vote, so we have encryption. We need to be able to correctly tally up votes. We have methods which we call homomorphic encryption, a way to tally votes without actually finding what an individual vote is. We have a way to make sure that votes are independent from each other. So even though they're done electronically, people can't just vote like you did. So have this independence of encryption. We have types of encryption which are called deniable encryption, which address the issue of coercibility. So people can't force you to vote the way they like just because there's some sort of electronic record of it. However, there are threats in electronic voting, which have to do with the fact that hardware, software has bugs. Sometimes code could be malicious. Sometimes, even though code has been scrutinized for bugs and for having viruses, and everybody agrees it's a good code, at the time of the election, maybe somebody substituted another code for it. So what do we do about all this? I think that is the key place where cryptography can help besides privacy, and that is to enable us to be able to verify, so verifiability, to be able to verify that the code is appropriately designed, to be able to verify that the code that it's running is the code that was agreed on, And when I say verify, one has to give it a mathematical definition or an interpretation. And what I mean is that if there is a bug, if there is a mistake in the tallying of election, it will be found out. So I think that there's even a name for this that Rivest et al. Gave, which is software independence. They're saying, yes, maybe the election had some problem with it, either maliciously or otherwise, but if that's the case, it will be found out with very high probability. It is challenging how to do all this in a transparent way. So often, if we're going to go to the electronic elections, there are companies who are going to, let's say, propose an election system, and they might want to keep their code proprietary, because they want to have intellectual property rights. That's going to stand in the way of verifiability of the code. So the question is, how do you verify code while maintaining, let's say, maybe rights of, whoever came up with the software to keep it private? And there is a question of collusions. How do you make sure that during electronic election, there are no collusions by some subsets of the population against other subsets? And these are all technical challenges which I think can be overcome, but they require more technology, more mathematics, more scrutiny. So that was case one. I hope I still have time to put two more cases. So that was elections. Another example is electronic surveillance. So as we know, there's more and more electronic surveillance these days. In the US, for example, there are thousands of warrants that, let's say, the FBI, the police can request the companies such as Microsoft, Facebook, and so forth, that they can have surveillance against your digital communication. And sounds good because a court has authorized it, but the problem is that there's really very little scrutiny of this process. So we don't know what the magnitude of these, how much surveillance is being done. Often these things, of course, are done in a private manner because you don't want to go against an investigation. But according to law, the privacy only holds temporarily, and then they're supposed to be lifted, and somebody can appeal or to a higher court whether surveillance was legal or not. And it's very rare that that's done. So a particular judge in the US, Judge Smith, actually proposed some method, paper-based method for doing so, where there would be some sort of a paper trail of the fact that there was a surveillance order without actually having any detail about who is the person, but there will be some sort of metadata. Turns out that electronically you can do much better than that. So you can really check, you can check that all rules were followed, that the FBI followed, let's say, the rules, the courts authorize the surveillance, and that when things expire, then gag orders will be lifted and so forth. And all this maintaining complete privacy. So this is something that has to do with zero-knowledge proofs, for example. There might be other methods to do it. So we have actually very sophisticated, nimble ways to improve accountability for court practices. And the last example is an example that I think Niva alluded to, and that is what about systems that are based on data, like machine learning type system, for example, for bail, to determine bail, but doing it based on previous bail rulings. There was a Proposition 25 in California on the ballot. It was voted down mostly because the feeling was that these programs that will be machine learning programs that learn from past data might not be fair, might essentially replace a bad old system, which is cash bail, by a bad new system. Again, as a computer scientist, which is what you asked about, I would say that there are three things to think about in terms of the bail. One is, which is the company that's writing this bail software? What access they have to? What is the old data? Two, once they propose a system, who is going to verify it? Again, that's key, verification. And how do you actually define what it means to verify a machine learning system? So what is it that you actually check in terms of its compatibility with old data? You have to talk about fairness, whether the old data was fair for minorities and whether the new system hasn't introduced new unfairness. And you have to actually address changing distributions of your clientele. There might be a different type of distribution of people who come up to judgment, and you want to make sure that your system will treat them appropriately. Again, these are all questions that people are working on these days in terms of machine learning, type systems, how do you scrutinize them? How do you verify them? How do you make sure that even if they were trained on a certain kind of data, they will work for new data? I think that's all I'll say right now, although you might ask me something else.
Well, thank you so much. It sounds like a lot of solutions that you have already, and we will be taking a closer look at technology later and safety aspects as well. But now, to complete our wonderful panelists, I may welcome Lisa Herzog, Professor of Political Philosophy at the Faculty of Philosophy and the Center for Philosophy, Politics and Economics of the University of Groningen. She holds awards for philosophy, social ethics, and science. And the current focus of her work are workplace democracy, professional ethics, and the role of knowledge in democracies. We appreciate you taking the time to being with us today. And we just spoke about the computer science perspective. Now I would like to know from a humanities perspective, what is your impression regarding digitization and democracy?
Thank you very much for the warm welcome, and thank you for having me here. So I speak from the perspective of political philosophy with a background in economics. I can't claim to speak for all of humanities, but one thing that is specific to the humanities is, I guess, some awareness and attention to the fact that our social practices, or also to some extent our values, they have developed historically, and they are, at least up to a point, up to us. And democracy, in a sense, is up to us. And I've worked a lot on the history of ideas, of how we got to hold the values we hold today. And one thing I've worked on is this idea, it's actually more a metaphor, in Adam Smith about an invisible hand, some kind of spontaneous mechanism that automatically leads to good outcomes. And when I think about technology and democracy, I'm often reminded of this old metaphor, in the sense that there seem to be often hidden assumptions and arguments that some things will just follow on their own. There will be some automatism, maybe some kind of teleology that things will lead to a good outcome. And here, I think it's very important, and that's, I guess, a humanities contribution here, to say that no, this is up to us. This is human processes, and they depend a lot on the ideas that we take for granted, the very concepts and words we use to talking about this thing. And I want to quote Hannah Arendt on one thing, because people have mentioned that some of these things are self-evident. Yes, that's right. But Arendt has this nice remark on the American Declaration of Independence, where she says, they actually wrote, we hold these truths to be self-evident. So even if things are self-evident, they need to be upheld by people, and they need to be defended in times of crisis as well. And that leads then to the question, of course, what does it mean to uphold democracy in the face of these new digital changes? And there are many things one could mention here. I'll just focus on one for now. Democracies need ways of getting information to people, of integrating new insights into the policy process, for example, new scientific insights. And functioning democracies have a whole set of institutions that one could summarize as a kind of epistemic infrastructure, an infrastructure for knowledge, schools, media, channels of communication, all these things. And here the digital transformation has, of course, changed many things. And one is that it has disrupted many existing epistemic infrastructures. One point that I think often gets neglected is that it has pulled the rug from under the feet of local journalism. That's an indirect effect of how the advertisement market works, but that is actually quite important for democracy, and it has indirectly to do with how the internet and Google and other platforms have reshaped the financial flows in advertisement. It has also enabled lots of new forms of communication that are ungated, or relatively little gatekeeping is taking place compared to the old model of journalism, as Niva mentioned already. Some of it for the good, some of it not so much. And a lot of these developments took place with very little oversight. And maybe that was in part because the internet, as we know it today, really came to fruition in a period where the belief in self-stabilizing forces was particularly strong. I mean, people sometimes dub it neoliberalism, but whatever you call it, especially in the US jurisprudence, you also have this idea of the marketplace of ideas, where truth will follow from battling ideas. And that suggests, you don't need to regulate these things. And that has also opened up the possibility for abuse by malevolent players, evil players, who have either purely economic interests and just don't care about a democracy, or they actually want to actively undermine open democratic societies. And in any case, they're not interested in maintaining the conditions of the possibility of democracy. And I think that's where lots of things need to happen. To make sure that the epistemic infrastructures for democracy function well. And it means partly thinking about how to regulate certain things that happen online, but it also means thinking about other parts of the epistemic infrastructure to adapt them to the digital age. For example, what does education mean here? I mean, there's so much talk about digital literacy, but have we really thought through what it means to educate children if all information in the sense of pure facts is actually available at your fingertips, but what you need is much more understanding contexts, connecting information, evaluating the trustworthiness of sources, these kinds of things. So there are lots of questions that arise when you think about all these different media and how the new media of the digital age come in here to make sure that it's democracy that adapts the media to its needs and not the other way around.
Thank you very much. The Leopoldina recently published a statement on democracy and digitization. And as a part of the working group, could you tell us, how does Leopoldina assess the state of democracy and digitization in Germany?
Yeah, let me maybe start with a quote that is sort of well known in Germany, and I've never actually encountered something comparable in other countries I've worked in, and it's called the Böckenförde dictum after a constitutional judge. And he said, democracy has preconditions that it cannot itself create. And I agree with the first part, democracy has preconditions. I don't necessarily agree with the second part, because some of these preconditions can actually be created through the democratic political process itself. And so the general message here is that other parts of society might have to be reined in to make sure they don't undermine democracy. And the Leopoldina working group, we looked at 4 dimensions of the relation between the digital transformation and democracy. We had to be a bit selective. There are so many issues. So we looked at the digitalization of infrastructures for democratic publics, changes in structures of information and communication, new forms of democratic participation, and changes in political self-determination, with a focus on social media platforms with their huge monopoly power as infrastructures of communication. And there were various recommendations. I don't think we'll have the time to run through all of them, but let me just briefly mention a few things. So one is that on these media platforms, there are curating processes taking place. It's not like there is no gatekeeping at all, because there are algorithms that determine what you see in your feed and what you don't see. And at the moment, those are business secrets of the media companies or the platform companies. And we know very little about what's going on there. And one of the recommendations is to open this curating process up to civil society and to user representatives to provide more transparency and to allow for users to challenge specific curating decisions. For example, if something gets deleted, what can you do then? Can you still reverse that decision? There are also recommendations about strengthening the provision of news in the online world, because that's the future. People do get their news, not on a TV, but through online sources. Also to strengthen democracy-friendly design, strengthen education, data journalism, so a whole range of things, either directly concerning the social media platforms or concerning other institutions that need to be strengthened, maybe a bit reinvented in certain cases, in order to function well hand in hand with the new online realities.
Thank you. So that was a perspective of Germany. Of course, I'd also like to know the perspective of Israel and the US. So Mrs. Elkin-Koren, maybe you can tell us what your perspective is from the Israel side?
So I don't think that we have any, unfortunately, an equivalent report like you produced in Germany, even though we probably should have. But I think it raises important, interesting questions that I actually see that are related to some extent to the comments, or the introductory comments that we've heard from Shafi as well, and that is the question of who decides, right? And so I think, I see that as a question that actually relates to both of you. That is, when we think of oversighting platforms, the question is, who is doing that, right? So this is a question to you, Lisa. If you want to have you want to create some transparency for users, but in fact, users are overwhelmed with a lot of data, and they want someone else to make these choices for them. Otherwise, they would not use this type of social media. And I think that one of the reasons that we've seen the rise of social media is because people had demand for this type of, and so if the platforms cannot be the guardians, who is going to be the guardians? The government is going to be the guardian. This is something that would definitely not be acceptable in the United States, and hopefully not in Israel as well. And the reason I think it's also relate to what Shafi was describing is that, Shafi, you also talked about, verification in bail systems, for instance, in order to overcome some of the fairness concerns that we have. And here again, the question is, who would decide? And the reason I'm asking this is that as we move to some technological solutions, we sort of assume that we can technologically define this, or that maybe the technical people or the designers, the developers will make these decisions. Whereas in our constitutional framework, in law, we normally think of social institutions such as legislators, courts. We normally don't make this decision at a very technical level. We sort of have general principles, and we think that some judge down the road will make the decision. We cannot verify this mathematically. I think, as you suggested, that is where I see a gap that I'm not sure how we should bridge.
Yeah, I would like your response. What is your perspective?
So I think that I agree that, I don't know if I agree, because I'm not sure you both agreed with each other. So, but in terms of, so I'm curious, why should we trust companies? So in other words, there's sort of like we were talking about, there are two sides of the coin. There are the companies, right, that are offering us platforms, and then there are governments and social institutions that have been around for a long time. It seems like the state of the world right now is that we are very suspicious of governments, but we are willing to, give up our privacy, give up almost any kind of control to these giants that have our data and make our life, easy to communicate and to do whatever we want to do. So I would trust a government more than I would trust a big company that stands to make a profit. However, having said that, I don't want to trust the government. I want to be able to put some sort of verification process in place. So what you're asking is, who's going to agree even what the verification process is? Well, if we're talking about digital tools, I think that you can come up with a definition of what is it that you want to verify. But I don't think the definition should be left only to us, like us, I'm talking about a computer scientist or a mathematician, because we need to talk to people who are, have made these decisions in the past, lawyers, judges, politicians. This should be done together. But once we understand sort of the spirit of what you want to enforce, I do think that these things can be translated into mathematics in a way that might be more satisfying than what we have right now, done informally, you know, by people, by judges. So I see an opportunity rather than, I'm more optimistic than pessimistic, because I do trust mathematics. Now there's a question of how to go from mathematics to a technology that implements it. There is a problem because, again, profit motives come in. So there's huge amounts of money usually. I remember there was this HAVA regulation, I think it was 2002 in the United States. It was help, HAVA was help election, I'm trying to remember exactly what it stood for. Let me just, but regardless, I think it was Help America Vote Act. So there were like $4 or $9 billion or something in the range of money dedicated to this idea that we're going to vote with electronic machines. But then companies come in and they build the machines and they build machines that are not trustworthy. Okay, so there's a step from mathematics, definitions, agreement, you know, via process that goes back and forth between lawmakers and let's say people who design the system, and then there are people who make money from building it. So you want to make sure that there's control, you know, there are controls and checks and balances put into place to that. You know, another perspective that people have these days is this idea of decentralization, you know, using blockchains and so forth, or the idea of blockchains to be able to decide everything in a truly sort of direct democracy, where you have votes and there's consensus protocols that are going to run, and agreements is going to be reached just by reaching directly to the public. Those are also interesting possibilities out there. They have technical challenges. How do you make sure that one person is represented once and not multiple times? How do you run consensus protocols where you know, collusions don't take place against you know, the rest of the people who participate in the consensus protocol? So I guess to answer your question, who decides how to verify it's a good question. I think there are many ways to go. You know, speaking as a mathematician, a theoretical computer scientist, and a cryptographer, I know the tools out there. I know what I would do if I had full control. How to bridge this with governments is unclear to me.
I have one question, because you said people are willing to give their data and information, for example, to big companies, but not to the government. Do you think it is voluntarily, or are they maybe just giving the data because they don't realize that they're giving it out?
I think that people are much more interested in utility than in privacy. So you want to send an email, you want to be able to purchase something over the internet, you want to watch a movie, and you want to do it very quickly. And it takes time to realize that at the same time you are going to be flooded with ads. I mean, we all notice it now. It's impossible to read the paper without getting a ton of ads every time that you click on an article. My sense is that people are going to soon get fed up with it, so they'll understand that it will be much better to use systems who don't continuously monetize on your lack of privacy. So I don't think it's lack of awareness. I just think that people are focused on utility and short-term gain rather than sort of a long-term view.
Okay, thank you. Well, maybe we can find out from our audience that is here today. I want to invite you again to submit your questions into the Q&A tool, and then I can fill them into our discussion. Ms. Herzog, I'd like to know from your perspective, who would you say are the main drivers of democracy?
Well, if it's not the citizen, who's going to do it? I mean, this is very much a sort of chicken and egg thing, but I mean, democracy is power to the people, and you can't run democracy without Democrats. So it's never just institutions, because all institutions can get hollowed out and become sort of, empty shells. But citizens on their own is rarely the answer. It's usually citizens who organize, do things together. And that's also then part of an answer that I have to Niva's question. I think we should not think about these problems only as government here, big companies there. I think citizens, but especially citizens organized in civil society organizations, NGOs and so on. That's a very important third factor here. And I totally agree that normal citizens don't want to spend all their evenings reading up on privacy details and so on. But if there are reliable NGOs that are trustworthy, that build up a reputation for competence also in this area, they need all the technical and legal skills and so on, then it's possible to go sort of rely on these. And I think that's something where things are still developing, but there are more and more NGOs developing that look at what are the big media platforms doing, and that ideally you would want to have a few of them so that there's a sort of a friendly competition between them. So if one of them makes a mistake or overlooks something, another one is going to come in. So I think that that's part of what we will hopefully see develop more in the future here. But in addition to that, I think it's right that citizens often just go along and they want the immediate utility and they want to be connected and so on. But when things go massively wrong, there need to be channels of communication. And if people feel that their rights have been violated, they will stand up, they are motivated to do something. But that's when it becomes critical that they know where to turn. Where can I go if, I don't know, my political post got deleted because of an error in the algorithm or something like that. And I think that is a crucial way of also getting feedback into these systems, that those who really feel that their rights or interests have been violated can also bring this forward. And I think that creating these kinds of channels and then also combining them with NGOs and the political system and all this, and also in the end having all of it backed up by the legal system, that's the long-term way of reining in these powerful players, I think.
We do have a question from the audience regarding that, and they are asking about academia. So who should regulate? Who can you trust? Should academia, rather than governments and companies, be the trusted partners? Academia does have diverse expertise too.
I'd like to respond to that, but also to link to what Lisa and Shafi were saying. It's true. I think that academia is has the legacy of being an independent player and has the ethical institutions and commitments to independent scientific work. And I think that that is something to value, and that is something that is important, especially nowadays, when we cannot agree on what is true, right? I mean, this is one of the problems. I think that many of us want to think that the problem, the crisis that we are experiencing in liberal democracies is about, is related to technology and started with social media platform. But I think that some of the problems that we are experiencing is that we simply disagree on many issues, and people are, that are looking for utility, as Shafi said, they just want to get the truth that is more comfortable to them, and that they have a demand for some truth. And I think that here, even if we give them more tools, like Lisa, that you're suggesting, give them the variety, allow them to choose, that is a market of ideas. And they may or may not opt for that. And I think that that is where we may have to start think, more systematically on institutions. And I think that we don't have sufficient institutions. There is a huge gap between the institutions that we need in order to appeal, in order to understand, in order to receive transparency, in order to get access to scientific work, like for academia to provide some scientific work. It has to have access to the piles of data in Facebook and Google. But right now, if you want to do a study, you just can't do that, right? They wouldn't let you in. And I think that is where, governments, for instance, could help, could actually provide, create some duties on, giving access to academic work to scientists in order to study some of these piles of data and provide more transparency and thereby more choice to people and more accountability on the platforms.
Thank you.
I want to comment something about this. It just sort of occurred to me with regard to this question about letting academics be the trusted party. In a sense, I think that with the COVID, what happened is that the trust in science really took a huge leap, right? I mean, it kind of turned things around. We are now having a chance to go back to our lives by trusting scientists, whether they're in companies or academics. I don't think is really the point here. So perhaps trusting academics or researchers to come up with the right mechanisms, to talk between lawyers and technologists is not such a bad idea.
We have a question from the audience for you. In the US election, voting has paper trail. Will you manage to drop this security network by technological advances, or will it always be needed for transparent verification?
So I know, in fact, I think in 2007 in the US, after there was found some bugs in these Diebold machines, there was really mass hysteria, and states issued regulations that banned voting without a paper trail. I think it was in like 40 out of 50 states. Although there are a few states where that's not the case. I think Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, but in some counties at least. However, I think the principle of paper trail is a great principle because it exactly speaks to the heart of verification. So if things fail, then you have the paper trail that is it gives you checks and balances. But I don't think the issue is that it's paper. The issue is that there is another mechanism to verify the vote. And I definitely think that you could implement the paper trail also in a digital manner. So in other words, if you think that there's one machine that's doing the counting or doing the election, and then there's an independent machine that's doing the verification, and by definition, it's a transparent machine, it's a simpler machine, then it could replace kind of the paper aspect of it. So in my mind, the paper trail is the proxy right now for verification, but I don't think it inherently has to be paper. After all, we saw this in the US election, right? People were sitting and counting paper. You could imagine a machine that's counting, some kind of a digital information, but it's an independent machine to the process of voting.
Thank you very much. Mrs. Herzog, we have a question for you from the audience. A question from the perspective of Europe. There are companies and there are governments not interested in civil liberties, even curbing these. What are your thoughts to empower users while retaining mediation against those who abuse the system?
That is, of course, a very difficult balance to strike. But we do have these malevolent players, and it is a challenge where part of it is the power of the big players, where governments really need to reinforce their right to legislate and to also enforce certain mechanisms. But part of it is, again, this challenge, okay, if we regulate speech on certain platforms, for example, in order to exclude certain attempts at abuse, could we then also risk hitting the wrong people who want to make use of their right of free speech? And I think when you have that kind of difficult constellation, you cannot just have a sort of one-size-fits-all approach. You need to proceduralize this. And then I should probably hand over to Niva about the legal details, but you need to have contestable procedures where both sides that might be hit by a law that is either over-inclusive or under-inclusive can then correct this. And it will probably take some time till one hits the right balance, and it will have to be readjusted over time. But I don't think there's any way out of having to proceduralize where these lines are being drawn. And yeah, sometimes people then ask, well, how on earth is this going to be financed? Who can pay for all these legal proceedings and so on? But I mean, if you tax these companies a bit more and made them contribute to the society and public infrastructure, there would be a lot of money available for these kinds of things. So I think it's really a matter of strengthening public oversight without, again, having an almighty state or some fantasies about a Leviathan taking care of everything. I mean, I think actually it was interesting that you, Shafi, said earlier that people seem to trust the companies more. I'm not sure this is true for the German context. I mean, in Germany, there's, I think, more trust in the government, maybe sometimes a bit too much of it. But then the other side of that is that the government also needs to live up to its responsibilities to regulate these things.
I don't know that people would say that they trust it more. It's just implicitly they do.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
I think this is also changing. So I think that like in the early days of the internet, like 30 years ago, you know, people thought of, you know, of technology as a solution to a lot of problems. It generated a lot of hopes and optimism. And I think that companies were trusted as, you know, do no evil, right? This is like, let's take it on its face. And I think that now I think that we have moved to the other extreme, which I don't think is as good as well, because it's like not all companies are evil, right? But I think that, that in some of the public debates, we see that approach that is very suspicious of companies, you know, regardless of what they actually do. Which I don't think is good as well. I think that it's gonna take time to find like a middle way where we can align, you know, some of the technological development with the social institutions that we need in order to enable some, you know, social choice related to these issues. And again, I think that one of the problems that we're facing is that if we cannot agree ahead of time, that makes it really difficult, because then we cannot use technology as a solution, because mathematically and technically, people that develop the systems, they want to get a definition of what is fair, right? And what is legal, and then to be able to verify it. But I think that we live in societies that cannot agree on that. And the way the law enabled us to live so far in democracies was that we didn't have to agree on that. We agreed that we all need to be fair, but we didn't have to agree on the details in specific cases. And so, but right now, in order to create machines that would do that, we really have to agree on that ex ante, and sometimes we cannot.
Professor Elkin-Koren, we have a question from the audience for you. How will citizenship be enacted when advanced technologies increasingly mediate all relations and decisions in society?
And so I would actually like to use what you know, the proposal that Lisa has made about, you know, procedural justice, creating opportunities for citizens to get a notice of what decisions were made related to them. Why does their feed look that way? How can they appeal a choice that was made by their automated, you know, tax, the tax system, right? Or the social benefits that were assigned to them. And I think there are actually very interesting attempts to create such procedures that would enable people to contest, to first be aware that an automated decision was made, and then to contest it. And I think the European Union has done a lot of, you know, has created a platform in the GDPR for automated decision-making processes, where companies are held accountable to actually notify and provide these procedures for explanations and appeal. And I think that is a good way to go.
Could I briefly add something?
Yes, please.
I agree. And I would want to add one dimension here, which is that it's often the more privileged ones that dare to challenge decisions and that know how to deal with complex systems, that know how to get advice. And I mean, we do live in societies with an unequal distribution of knowledge. And if you're a university educated person, you have your university educated friends and colleagues, and it's much easier. And it's also much easier to develop the kind of self-confidence to take advantage of these kinds of procedures that are in place to protect citizens. And I think one thing that's very important, and that's also has to do with the core of democracy really, is to make sure that they are really open to everyone. And there, I mean, one could say a lot about education, who really learns about these things in what ways, but also just socioeconomic inequality in a very sort of old-fashioned sense. How can we make sure that people from all backgrounds get access to these procedures? And I mean, one of sort of dystopian scenario that one can get is that for sort of the lower half of the socioeconomic spectrum, it's always automated decisions and no way to challenge them. And sort of the privileged ones, they get personalized advice, they can challenge decisions and so on. And that would be deeply undemocratic. And so I think in all areas where algorithmic governance is taking over, that's going to be a really important thing to pay attention to.
Well, thank you, Professor Goldwasser. We have a question that is actually relating exactly to that. A question for you saying, speaking about people providing their data in exchange for utility, which role does media literacy education play as a mean of enabling people to make decisions concerning their own privacy self-reliantly? I say that kind of goes exactly into that, what Professor Herzog just now said.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I think that unfortunately, media literacy and the understanding of what you give up when you allow, when you use platforms which do not provide privacy is extremely important. I mean, again, you can't force people not to, you know, to not give their information. Perhaps you could come up with alternative platforms where they get compensated for giving information, and then they will have an incentive, you know, to use platforms where you either have privacy, or if you give up your data, you actually get compensated for it. So in other words, right now we just give it up without any reward. If there were alternatives where you would give it up for a reward, perhaps people would switch to it. So it's not so much that they would care about their privacy, but they certainly would care about maybe getting more out of keeping privacy. You see what I'm saying? So that you might be able to incentivize it for other reasons, not just for keeping your privacy.
I have a question there because this is a discussion that has been around for a while. What is hindering the progress? Why is it not happening? Because a lot of people are saying that is exactly what needs to happen, but not much is happening. So who needs to drive that? How can we get there?
So that's a very good question, because as you point out, there has to be some motivation, probably some commercial motivation for people to develop such platforms, alternative platforms. Or people are talking about co-ops, you know, data co-ops where people contribute their data and get compensated for it. Again, who is to benefit from building such a platform? Perhaps philanthropists are going to be interested in putting their money in order to support the building such platforms, and perhaps someone will find some kind of economic model to make a profit and for building such alternative platforms. People, they never cease to surprise you in finding ways to make profit. And perhaps here the intended consequence would be that we will have more agile systems, which do benefit people when they keep their information rather than when they give it away.
Okay. Thank you. Yes, please.
So my take on this is a bit different. I think that we live in times where there's so many opportunities related to data and what you could do with this. And the data has the logic of accumulation. The more data you have, you can do more with this. And I think that we often think about these issues in the context of commercial misuse. But in many cases, like in medicine, right, in health, we really want to be cured, right? And if we would give more data, and that would be helpful, we will never, right, object to that. And sometimes, and again, I think that I think that one of the problems that we are facing in public debates related to the use of data is that this is the binary between privacy and utility is not getting us anywhere. And I think that there are very interesting proposals in terms of configuration of the data flow that are envisioning ways in which people can share data. It could still be useful, but they would not feel that they are compromising something that is called privacy, like creating an API that would allow some data in and out. I mean, we're sort of the idea of like locking ourselves between either sharing or not sharing. This binary, I think, is one of the problems in the current debate.
Well, I absolutely agree with you. And when I said alternative platforms, what I meant is platforms where you could still get utility, but without giving up your privacy. And we have methods to do so, yeah.
Thank you. Professor Elkin-Koren, we have another question from the audience, which are the two most important points when it comes to good governance of technology and the internet?
The most important two. That's a tough question. I think, you know, so I think my gut reaction would be accountability. I think that is what we're missing. That is the most important thing that we're missing now, because a lot of you know, companies and technologies enabled some harm to remain unaccountable in the current system. And I think that is one of the problems that we are facing nowadays. And I think that the second point that I would make is that, so enhancing accountability would definitely be at the top of my list in good governance. And I think the second would be creating some, I wouldn't say transparency, because I think transparency is you know, is something that is really difficult to achieve. But I think disrupting, you know, creating some friction in the way in which data is flowing from one place to another, so that we can create more opportunities for intervention, either by civil society or by scientific work or by competing companies. I think that is what we need in that environment where we have very dominant players that are overtaking the playfield.
Our time is almost up, at least for this panel. I'm sure we could go on for hours and hours. I feel like the conversation has just started. But before we leave this panel, I would like to ask all three of you for a short final statement, your main takeaway for the audience. Professor Herzog, would you start, please?
Yeah, I guess if I have to keep it very brief, the main point is to really keep what the social democratic tradition is called the primacy of politics, or the primacy of democracy also in the digital sphere, and shape digital media, digital processes such that they can support our societies in maintaining democracy, but also, and that's sometimes forgotten because of all the negative stuff, maybe also becoming more democratic, because democracy is never a finished project, and new forms of communication can really open up new opportunities for participation, information sharing, support for civil society, and so on. So once we've addressed some of the biggest problems, we should also look forward to how could we strengthen the positive forces that make use of digital technologies in ways that really strengthen democracy and make it more democratic.
Thank you. Professor Goldwasser, your final takeaway.
So my final takeaway is that indeed, I think that mathematics and technology can allow our democracy to be more nimble rather than otherwise, that it allows us finer control, more efficiency, and I believe also more accountability, oversight, and verifiability. Now, whether that's done today or not, that's a different question. I don't think it is. I think we should pay a lot of attention to verifying our systems, to making absolutely sure that there is a way to appeal digital processes and there is a way to modify them to step with the time. So we don't want to get into a situation where we have a new system in place and then it will take us, 20 years to move it out. We want to kind of take advantage of what digital technology helps us do. That is, be more efficient, be modifiable, and be accountable. So I'm optimistic at what we can do in principle, but I'm not so sure whether it's going to be an easy task to take these things that we can do in principle and translate them to reality.
Thank you very much. Professor Elkin-Koren, your final remarks for this panel.
So I think Shafi started with her view of democracy, about participation in voting, and I think that is a really important point. I would add to that an important component in liberal democracies is ensuring civil rights, and we normally do that in law by principles such as separation of powers and judicial oversight and the rule of law, that governments should do only what they're authorized to do by law, and that people will not be penalized without legal ground, and also by defining legal rights such as freedom of speech and privacy. And I think that as lawyers, we're facing a crisis because a lot of these governing tools are now based on algorithms and data, and our legal tools are not equipped to that. And we need to reimagine these tools, and we need to do it not alone by the help of people that are developing systems, that are designing systems, and also people that are thinking about the political economy or the ethical aspects of these systems, because just applying these tools in the old-fashioned way is not going to be helpful. So reimagining these checks and balances and being open-minded and collaborating, that is my takeaway.
Well, thank you so much. So my takeaways from you are accountability, trust, participation, civil rights, and cooperation, that society as one can achieve a lot. So thank you for now. We've taken a look at where we stand right now, and there is another important panel ahead of you today. Content moderation will be the topic in 45 minutes. I'm very much looking forward to that discussion as well. And then tomorrow we will take a close look at new directions and where the potential lies for enhancing democracy. And then we will conclude with digitization and democracy. Where do we go from here? I would like to say thank you so much to our wonderful panelists, Professor Shafi Goldwasser, Professor Niva Elkin-Koren, and Professor Lisa Herzog. Thank you so much for this great input. And of course, thank you as well to our audience for your time, for your input, for your questions, and for this important discussion. And I'm looking forward to continuing this conversation in the coming hours today and tomorrow. And until then, thank you so much. Take care and bye-bye.